My name is Munis Farooqi. I'm the director of the Institute for South Asia Studies, this lovely space around us. It gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome you to the fourth Tagore Visiting Scholar Lecture at UC Berkeley. This year's visiting scholar is none other than tonight's speaker, Dr. Michael Collins, Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary British History at the University College London. Welcome, Michael. Dr. Collins led a fascinating seminar titled Disagreeing Well? Conversations with Tagore, and we are excited to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Parson to the podium.
It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Collins. His research focuses on the development of political ideas in Britain since 1940, as well as the social and cultural history of migration and settlement in post-war Britain. We are honored to have Professor Collins with us as part of the Tagore program.
Rahul, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you also for the very kind invitation to come to UC Berkeley. I'd like to say a special thanks to Drs. Maya and Shakti Das for funding this event and making this kind of scholarship possible and interaction possible. And as you'll see, the facilitation of this type of research and engagement with students is essentially the subject of my talk. So it's highly pertinent that you're enabling this kind of work to be done, because I don't believe it's actually done very much, either in the US and certainly not in the UK. Munis mentioned that I'm the fourth speaker, I think. I counted one more, which was Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty. He said something which I noted down and which I found very intimidating, and I'm going to recount. He said in 2019, when he spoke here, that it's difficult for Bengalis, he said, as a Bengali, to analyze Tagore, because Tagore is like the water you drink, the land you walk on, the sky you look at, the blood that courses through your veins. I fully understand the point he's making. When you get very close to a subject, it's hard to have critical distance. But boy, is that kind of an intimidating thing to open up a session like this with, for someone who is obviously not a Bengali. And so I'm actually the first non-Bengali speaker in this series. So I'm both very honored and somewhat in trepidation about what will befall me afterwards. There is, though, a serious issue here about access to Tagore, engagement with Tagore. How we do that critically and with nuance, and how we can bring Tagore into a wider framework of global intellectual history, of postcolonial studies, and imperial history of different types. As you'll have gathered from the introduction that Rahul gave, my interests are somewhat eclectic. What kind of ties them together is the British experience of being a colonial power and the process of decolonization, what the cultural, political legacies of that are. And in that conversation, Tagore, for me, is an extremely important voice and counterpoint. But it has to be said that he's not really studied actually that widely, certainly not in the UK curriculum. I'll come back to that. It was also said already that Tagore has many versions and presentations. He is indeed, or was, a poet, a dramatist, a singer, a songwriter, a novelist, actor, painter, political essayist, and global traveler, interlocutor, orator, a powerful voice articulating a very particular theory of human nature and an ideal of the good life that was deeply grounded, I argue, in the soil of India, as well as its religious and intellectual traditions. It's often said casually that Tagore was educated in the West, or that he was influenced by Western thinkers. And yet, when I look closely at the English language writings, I find relatively little trace of that, in fact, and I'll try to justify that argument as I unfold here. The different versions of Tagore are not just thematic, but also chronological. Tagore's ideas about education, for example, are developed at a very early stage of his life, including his brief sojourn at my university, UCL, in 1879. There's a picture of him here, a different kind of Tagore to the one that we're used to seeing, a classic Victorian presentation of the gentleman. And this photograph, I believe, does date from that year when he enrolled in some law classes at UCL. And the brutal truth is that he absolutely loathed it. I don't think it was exactly UCL's fault as such, but he recoiled from the constraints of the lecture theatre and the formality of the education environment. So if he was educated in the West, or in England in this sense, that was only in its loosest and essentially negative connotation of recoiling from something. Turning back to that chronology and the different Tagores, the 1880s through to around 1910 is another period where, and here I take it on faith from translations, I rely often on Partha Chatterjee's work, actually analysing his early essays and speeches. But Tagore is experimenting with a lot of ideas about Swadeshi and Swaraj, of self-rule, of home rule, and goes through what some refer to as a sort of strongly patriotic phase, where he produces a lot of the cultural content that would be worked up into a kind of Bengali nationalism. But as is well known, after 1905 through to 1910, after the partition of Bengal by Lord Curzon, Tagore is deeply shocked by what he sees as the excesses of nationalist resistance and the kind of violence that is inherent, he says, in the nationalist project. So this engenders a rethinking of his ideas about nationalism and the world historical conditions within which he lives, that of colonial domination, in this instance by the British. Then the post-partition phase from circa 1911 is the one point at which Tagore begins to really travel very widely and frequently, and also write profusely in English. The vast majority of his output after 1912 comes in the form of political essays and speeches, pamphlets, and writings of that type. And it's these works which are of primary interest to me. The travel is also very important to him. The dialogue was very important, the interaction with different voices around the world. And here, from one university to another, is a picture of Tagore at UC Berkeley in 1929, a later period. But he came to America on a number of occasions, and it was a very important reference point for him, a very important part of his intellectual journey. So the English writings of Tagore, they amount to, in the Sisir Kumar Das edited volumes, which have now been supplemented by, I think, a fourth volume, over 3,200 pages of text, folio-sized text in English. Some of the really important writings in English are Sadhana, 1913, based on lectures at the University of Illinois. Personality, again, based on lectures given in North America. Nationalism of the same year, 1917, lectures given in Japan and the United States, again, common reference point. Other works, The Center of Indian Culture, Greater India, The Religion of Man, 1931, a very important text written in English based on the Hibbert lectures delivered at Oxford in 1931. So to put it another way, and there's more, but to put it another way, there is a distinct English language Tagore, a body of literature which in its own right is substantial and profound and of distinctive historical interest. Potentially, I would hope to persuade you of enduring theoretical promise too. Admittedly, this methodological focus is also mandated by a linguistic deficiency. I do not know Bengali, so many of the nuances of Tagore's fiction, and especially poetry, would be lost in translation. But I console myself that it is in his non-fiction that we are more likely to find the Tagore who speaks to the world. That was a quote. That was not me. Those words were written in the introduction to the 2012 Penguin edition of Nationalism by the distinguished Indian historian Ramachandra Guha. And I quote those words really to remind us that despite his very Bengali surname, Ram Guha, I believe, was born into a Tamil family, and he speaks Kannada, Hindi, and English. So it's not only Anglophones or other speakers outside of India who do not have access or easy access. Everybody ultimately could learn Bengali and read Bengali script, but many people in India do not have ready access to the Bengali version of Tagore either. Millions of non-Bengali speakers. As a point of comparison, I have never heard anybody say that you can't engage seriously with the political thought and practice of Mahatma Gandhi because you don't read Gujarati. But Hind Swaraj and My Experiments with Truth were both written in Gujarati before they were translated into English. So there is an interesting difference between Gandhi and Tagore around the cultural politics of sort of ownership, as it were. Maybe we can talk about that in the question and answer session. Last point here in this section is to remember too that the Tagore and Gandhi debates themselves are conducted in English. So let me turn to those debates now. This photo shows Gandhi with Tagore in Shantiniketan in 1922, and the person with his back to us is Charlie Andrews, the Anglican priest who played an important role in facilitating their relationship and encounter. When Gandhi arrives back from his work in South Africa, finally, as it were, to embark on the mission that he had set himself in India, it's the very end of January 1915. Naturally, the first thing that he does is to go and visit his family. And then within 10 to 15 days, we find that Gandhi has arrived in Shantiniketan. Now, you might say this is incidental. I don't believe it is incidental. I think it was very purposeful. And I think that Gandhi had arrived back in India with a conscious desire to talk to Rabindranath about the substance of non-cooperation, about the ideals of Indian freedom. He wished for, solicited, and at some emotional level, I think, needed not just the intellectual engagement with Rabindranath, but at some level, his blessing. He said so many times, and I'm often keen to take people's word for it rather than say that they actually mean something else by that. The unfortunate thing is, in an age when we don't have WhatsApp or an ability to notify someone that you're not going to be at home, when Gandhi arrives at Vishwabharati, Tagore is in Calcutta. He's gone away for some other business, and this was very unfortunate, not least because I think on the 19th of February, Gandhi's mentor, Gokhale, passes away back in Mumbai. So Gandhi then returns to the east coast, to the west coast of India, and pays homage to Gokhale, observes the funeral rites, and then returns straight away again back to Shantiniketan to see Tagore. So it's clearly a very important and urgent piece of business for Mahatmaji. Thankfully, when he gets back, Tagore is there, and they indeed have a deep discussion about these matters. And the 10th of March is, I believe, known as Gandhi Day, still in Shantiniketan. Unfortunately, or just as a matter of interest and record, in July 1915, Tagore wrote privately to Andrews and criticized Gandhi quite heavily, using language which is, to an extent, sort of a little upsetting, but nonetheless is there in the archive, in the historical record, and is extremely pertinent to the debates that then unfold from 1920 through 1925 about non-cooperation and the Charkha, which I will come back to. He says to Andrews, "Only a moral tyrant like Gandhi can think he has the dreadful power to make his ideas prevail through the means of slavery." Very strong statement, definitely open to misinterpretation. But what Tagore is deeply concerned about is the politics of nationalism, the extent to which he feels Gandhi may mobilize what Tagore saw as the negative forces of embedded in the human condition. He felt that the nationalist movement was in danger of merely thriving on negation and rejection, rather than a higher ideal of some form of harmony or acceptance or synthesis. I'll come back to that in due course. But I want to then whiz forward from 1915 to 1932 to demonstrate in a way the incredible impact that I think Mahatma Gandhi had on Tagore, and vice versa, but certainly the incredible impact that Gandhi had on Tagore. This is Pune, 20th of September, 1932. If you know your colonial period history, you'll know that that's the first day that Gandhi had committed to a fast unto death in opposition to the separate electorates for untouchables. Gandhi wakes at 2:30 a.m. in the morning. I'm taking this, by the way, from the Lewis Fisher biography of Gandhi, which was published in 1951, which I find very, very compelling. He wakes at 2:30 in the morning and writes a letter to Tagore, whose approval I believe he craved. Quote, "This is early morning, 3 o'clock," he says, "of Tuesday. I enter the fiery gates at noon. If you can bless the effort, I want it. You have been a true friend because you have been a candid friend, often speaking your thoughts aloud. Though it can now only be during my fast, I will yet prize your criticism if your heart condemns my action. I am not too proud to make an open confession of a blunder, whatever the cost. If your heart approves of my action, I want your blessing. It will sustain me." And as this letter is in transit, a telegram arrives in telegram format, so it's short. And Tagore says, "It is worth sacrificing precious life for the sake of India's unity and her social integrity. It is worth sacrificing precious life. Stop. I fervently hope that we will not callously allow such national tragedy to reach its extreme lengths," full stop, as these telegrams go. But there's a sort of but in parenthesis hanging in the air. "Our sorrowing hearts will follow your sublime penance with reverence and love." Gandhi replies, "Thank you for your magnificent wire. It will sustain me in the midst of the storm." Now, there's two issues at stake here. One is the form and one is the substance of this disagreement. So let's just think about the form for a moment. The Chennai-based professor of anthropology and cultural studies, Ananta K. Giri, whose writing I find very compelling on this subject, has written, and I quote, "The Bhagavad Gita, a text that inspired Gandhi and many others during India's freedom struggle, tells us, and apologies for pronunciations here, tells us that in the Vishvarupa Darshana Yoga, that God, our eternal friend, has his habitation at the midpoint of Bada and Prabada, argument and counter-argument." Found that very interesting. When we read the argument and counter-argument of Gandhi and Tagore, Giri says, we realize that their argument was not for the sake of winning any egotistical victory, but for exploring truth. They argued with each other with love, and their argumentation combined cognition, but also empathy. Both Tagore and Gandhi were deeply concerned about the present and future of India, and they argued with each other with a passion for the sake of clarifying an appropriate agenda of action and mode of being for India's Swaraj and for a better world. So the characteristics of their debate are, among other things, an openness to challenge, a willingness to fully understand the other before you, or as part of the process of engagement. So Tagore would often write to Gandhi a letter and say, "You published this. Did you mean that? Is that exactly what you meant? I want to be sure that this is what you intended before I reply." If you counterpose that to the way that we conduct even sometimes academic debate these days, this is quite an example, a tough example to follow for sure. A belief in the possibility always of being wrong at the outset, profound sympathy, and vulnerability. The vulnerability comes through again and again in their voices, in their words, and in their interactions with each other. And that idea that making yourself vulnerable and open to critique is a deep moment of learning, something that we should commit to. This is the idea. So as I say, the conduct of their debate is a model of good practice, let's say excellent practice, but it's a very high bar for us in terms of disagreeing well. I'm not suggesting that we can all follow that lead exactly and conduct ourselves in the same way, but nonetheless, it is a model of, let's call it, virtuous behavior, and I'll come back to that word again. Then there's the substantive elements. I started here with Andrews, Gandhi, and Tagore, and here there are two further images of the relationship between the two. One in which is painted by Rabindranath Tagore, Tagore's son, in 1921, where the two are quite far apart, and a later one is painted by somebody at Tagore's ashram, whose name escapes me right now, but they are very much more intimate and closer together, and that's produced in the 1930s. The main points of disagreement, to summarize, are around non-cooperation, the issue of means and ends. Tagore is very strongly of the view that non-cooperation is not a good in itself. It can be used for very bad ends, negative ends, to mobilize negative views and opinions of other humans. Tagore is also substantively concerned about Gandhi's kind of model of virtue ethics, which requires, in Tagore's critique, homogenization. And this is a debate which takes place in the context of Gandhi's, I almost said tongue-in-cheek, because he teases Tagore quite a lot, saying, you know, you would do well to spin. The charkha is, of course, the spinning wheel, in case you're not familiar with that. But for Gandhi, the charkha is both a symbol of freedom from economic domination because of the cotton trade and the inequities of the cotton trade and its integrity to the economic system that the British had imposed on India. It's a symbol, but it's also substantive practice. It's a form of meditation and engagement with something which makes you relate to the bigger project, to the bigger ideal. At some level, it wouldn't have been that difficult for Rabindranath to pick up a spinning wheel and have a go. He could have been a good egg and done it, but he was adamant that he would never do this because, and this is the sort of the mark of the seriousness of the way they took this interaction. It was for him symbolic of the urge towards a regimentation, a uniformity, and the reduction of human creativity and complexity in the name of the nationalist ideal. And he was articulating these ideas, you know, having met Mussolini, having an emergent sense of what fascism could become, with a critique of bureaucracy as being something which was inimical to our humanity, and an already very well-developed educational philosophy which argued that we should be getting back to nature and learning in natural environments, this type of thing. So although Gandhi shared many of those ideals, Tagore felt that this kind of impulse for everybody to do the same thing, to fall into line, it gave him a sense of foreboding about what nationalism could become, about its disciplining and regimenting mechanisms. It's often said on this matter of substance then that in counterpoint, what Tagore is developing is a sort of theory that prizes reason and freedom, the creative spirit. I think on that we can all agree, but particularly these ideas about reason and freedom to reason, to question, to challenge, to be different. So Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum in the last 10 to 15 years have written quite a lot of really interesting, compelling stuff on this theme. As many of you will know, Sen has argued that the Indian tradition itself is characterized by features such as rationality, debate, heterodoxy, skepticism, pluralism, toleration of difference. I think Tagore would very much agree with that. And Sen labels this the argumentative tradition in the book that he published in 2005. The Gandhi-Tagore debate is a footnote in that long history, an important one, but a footnote that shows that the Indian tradition had always made space for disagreement and prefigures democracy and secularism at some level. Nussbaum emphasizes the spirit of critical inquiry that she thinks is integral to Tagore's writings and practice, and then anchors that in her writings about a democratic education. The freedom to reason and to critique tradition is held up by Nussbaum as a sort of defining characteristic of Tagore's work. And elsewhere, as you know, a wider literature has grown around Tagore as a cosmopolitan, or holding a cosmopolitan world view, even though Tagore wrote very plainly and emphatically, quote, "Neither the colorless vagueness of cosmopolitanism nor the fierce self-idolatry of nation worship is the goal of human history." This raises to me an interesting question about whether Tagore is best understood through this lens of freedom in something approximating a liberal framework, of which there are many, many versions, of course, or whether he leans more towards the stronger articulation of a predefined set of virtue ethics, something which is quite different, where the ends of the good life, as the philosophers call it, or just the good sometimes, are rather more substantively defined. There's an excellent book by a philosopher in Delhi called Bindu Puri, published in 2015, which deals with the philosophy, the Tagore-Gandhi debate through a philosophical framework, which it's a complex, very nuanced piece of work, but it does lean towards the presentation of Gandhi as a virtue ethicist who is sort of telling people what to do, what the good life looks like. And on that note, for example, as soon as he arrived in Shantiniketan, apparently in 1915, he started to tell Tagore he was eating too many shondesh and that he should change his diet. That type of disposition towards articulating a substantive theory of what we should and shouldn't do, whereas Tagore is cast as someone who deals with the freedom to reason without so much defining the ends. I think the story is a little bit more complex, slightly different. I think that Tagore had a very interesting way of exploring this discussion. For example, the freedom to critique, the freedom to choose, to reinvent is beautifully explored in The Home and the World, particularly through Bimala's story. Okay, there are many examples that we can take from Tagore's literature that demonstrate this. But he also has a very strong conception of truth with a capital T. Consider this. In a journal article in 1908 called East and West in Greater India, a printed text based on some lectures that he gave in Calcutta, he says, "It is our vanity which makes us think that this," by which he means the struggle for national independence, "is a battle between contending rights." Remember that rights are fundamental to a liberal discourse, having a right to something, whether it's a right to national self-determination or a right to free speech or so on. The only battle, Tagore says, is the eternal one between truth and untruth. In the same essay on Ram Mohan Roy, and this speaks to my point about groundedness in Indian traditions, Tagore says, Roy was able to assimilate the ideals of Europe so completely because he was not overwhelmed by them. There was no poverty or weakness on his side. He had ground of his own on which he could take his stand and where he could secure his acquisitions. The true wealth of India was not hidden from him. For this, he had already made his own. Consequently, he had within him the touchstone by which he could test the wealth of others. And I'm grateful to Rahul for reminding me of that quote. Continuing that theme, the great Tagore scholar Sabyasachi Bhattacharya wrote, "The creative mind selects and uses certain elements from history and from the social environment around him, but that mind retains its freedom in the act of creation. The Upanishads knew this. The poet received the message of the Upanishads by his own volition, by exercising his own mastery over it." And I think that's quite a good encapsulation of that creative relationship between tradition, the past, historicity, and the creative components. Moving towards towards the end and to try and come at this from a slightly different angle. I'm going to mention Edward Said, a famous post-colonial scholar, produced very, very important work in the late 70s, from the late 70s onwards, Orientalism in particular. But I remember reading Culture and Imperialism, which he published in the early 90s, in which Said casually refers fleetingly to Tagore as the nationalist poet of Bengal. And I remember being prompted at the time to think that we really need to do an awful lot more research on Tagore in order to present a more complex and nuanced position on him to an Anglophone readership. To put it bluntly, I thought this was a wholly inadequate way of dealing, of dropping Tagore in a paragraph. But of course, this was someone who was immensely influential speaking, right? Everybody read Said. So if you were coming to Tagore, this was your basic understanding. Did you need to look further? Not sure. Continuing with the Said theme, a much later work, Reflections on Exile, which I would like to just quote from at some length. So if you could just bear with me, it's very much pertinent to the discussion here. This is Edward Said speaking. The historical experience of imperialism for the imperialized entails subservience and exclusion. Therefore, the historical experience of nationalist resistance and decolonization was designed for liberation and inclusion. Much of what went wrong in the subsequent development of nationalism was the direct result of either forgetting or rejecting this edifying equation. So far as liberation was concerned, the very notion of historical experience itself involved an acknowledgement that both the dominant and the subaltern in imperialism actually shared the same irreducibly secular world. Now, I think this is a slightly misleading use of the term secular. I don't think he means non-religious. I think he means historical. Again, it's another way of saying historical time period or historicity. However, I think it is misleading, and I'll try to explain why. Said continues, if so, there was only one worldly cultural space, the common possession of all humankind, and also a universal language of rights and ideals in which to wage the struggle for liberation and inclusion. To some extent, this acknowledgement reflected the national reality. That is, if as a Senegalese or an Indian, you were educated within the imperial framework in English or French, they would perforce be part of your world. Césaire's language, referring to the Francophone philosopher Aimé Césaire, his language, conceptual vocabulary and values in his discourse on colonialism were those of Voltaire and Marx. The object of his polemic was to rescue their liberating ideas from the corruptions forced on poor West Indian natives by empire. So to read and interpret meant to read in French and other languages for liberation and inclusion. Said then says, it did not mean throwing out the masterpieces of Western culture along with the language of the colonial bureaucrat who claimed to be representing them. It's a very good line, who in the end was forced to leave. Nor did it mean inventing a special jargon to be used only by natives. If Western humanism was discredited by its practices and hypocrisy, these needed to be exposed and a more universal humanism enacted and taught. Now, in many ways, this resonates with a lot of what's written about Tagore. I'm going to take you back now to Tagore's voice, back to the 20th of September, 1932, when Tagore gives one of those kind of duty of care speeches to the students and staff at Shantiniketan. Gandhiji is embarking on a fast unto death. It's very important that Tagore explains to people what's going on because it's very, very traumatic for all concerned. Tagore to the students and staff. The penance which Mahatmaji has taken upon himself is not a ritual, but a message to all India and the world. Let us try to understand the meaning of his message. No civilized society can thrive upon victims whose humanity has been permanently mutilated. Those whom we keep down inevitably drag us down. We insult our own humanity by insulting man where he is helpless and where he is not of our own kin. Mahatmaji has repeatedly pointed out the danger of those divisions in our own country, an obvious reference to untouchability in this context. Against the deep-seated moral weakness in our society, Mahatmaji has pronounced his ultimatum. We have observed that the English people are puzzled at the step that Mahatmaji has been compelled to take. They confess that they fail to understand it. I believe the reason for their failure is owing to the fact that the language of Mahatmaji is fundamentally different to their own. I ask them to remember, that's the British, the reason of their failure is I ask them to remember the terrible days of atrocities that reddened in blood at their door when dismemberment was being forced on Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. Those Englishmen who imagined it to be disastrous to the integrity of their empire did not scruple to kill and be killed, or even to tear into shreds the decency of civilized codes of honor. Essentially, the British, Tagore is saying, were ready to indulge in what was called black and tan violence, the bloodbath of the Irish partition, to prevent the dismemberment of empire for an instrumental end, which was framed within a conception of power and control. That was the goal. Keep the territory, maintain the integrity of empire. Gandhi is committing a self-sacrifice, what sometimes people call self-immolation, of one person, himself, to prevent the dismemberment of Indian Samaj, society. This was the language of non-violence. It is an act that expresses a principle that Tagore and Gandhi both agreed was at the core of the human condition, divine immanence in the world, as expressed through the ideal of love. And that is the word which is used again and again and again in the texts, love. Because Gandhi's self-sacrifice is an act of love, that is why the West cannot decipher it. That's what Tagore is essentially saying in this speech to his students. Now, Andrews, back here, referred to Gandhi's fast and possible self-sacrifice with reference to, you've guessed it, Jesus Christ. This is in 1933 when Gandhi is looking to repeat a fast in the same frame. And he says, "You have evidently come to the point of forcing the issue, of morally forcing it. And I have to think this out in terms of Christ. I think he did force the issue, that's Christ, when he set his pace steadfastly to go to Jerusalem." So there's a sort of epic comparison between these two figures, which many people have made. But the point, the parallel, is that this act of love and self-sacrifice is for universal emancipation, not of just one, but of everybody. That's the principle embedded in the crucifixion. So the parallels are there, but it's not a borrowing. It's a coincidence. It's a sameness that occurs maybe only once in an epoch, or maybe once in 1,000 years, but it's a coincidence. Likewise, I argue, Tagore found immense pleasure and comfort and inspiration to a point in the spirit of Romanticism in European poetry and art. He marveled at the revelation of this deepest connection and the similarities between East and West, as people used to say. But he did not derive his aesthetic principles from those sources. He was not educated by them in that literal sense. He did not borrow from them in that sense. He had already developed his ideas about Jiban, Debata, the life-giving joy that drives human creativity, and the essence of the human condition being grounded in that creativity from his readings of the Upanishads. So going back to Said's earlier argument then, Tagore's explanation of Gandhi's sacrifice does not use the language of Western liberalism or Marx or Voltaire or any other thinker that you care to mention. There may be this synchronicity and synergy, but there isn't a derivation or a borrowing. And that's important because, as so many of you know, many people refer casually to Tagore as being someone who was unduly influenced by Western sources. To reiterate and sum up, he explicitly rejected anti-colonial nationalism, the main vehicle for freedom, the freedom struggle that most colonized people around the world were engaged with at this point in time. He saw it as a derivative discourse, to use Partha Chatterjee's phrase. He saw it as a way of creating only a new cage for us to live in. Nationalism worked to destroy the truths of human diversity and creativity, which Tagore saw as being embedded in Indian history itself, par excellence. And of course, by that I mean the history of the whole subcontinent, pre-partition, very importantly. This further contradicts Edward Said's rendering, and I think gives us a sense of just how often Tagore is misrepresented. Now, what's this got to do with the disagreeing well part? Here I just will conclude briefly. How do we educate for disagreeing well? I read a great article in the American Scholar Journal just a few months ago by Mark Edmondson, who's a scholar of literature, called Teach the Conflicts, that we must encourage students to embrace the conflict that we find in the literature. I think that's a great idea. I'm all in favor of it. I wonder if we've lost touch with teaching the greats and the great lives for different reasons, and whether we need to revisit that. Francis Fukuyama has recently written that liberal democracies have become very skeptical about theories of human nature that posit explicit hierarchies of ends in favor of what the philosophers call deontological positions, that is, a language of rights which is decontextualized. We arrive at the right answers through a process of rational debate, decontextualized reasoning. And in that theory, the choosing subject is the most important thing in a human society, our freedom to choose. Teaching great lives and great thinkers, as it were, is obviously out of fashion. But what's even more out of fashion, has been for quite a long time, at least in my parochial UK context, is teaching philosophers and thinkers whose political action is grounded in virtue ethics and a conception of the divine. They're seen as topics to be avoided, particularly in history. To borrow a phrase from Tony Blair's communications director from his time as Prime Minister many years ago now, we don't do God. The English language Tagore, especially the political thought and educational theory, very much does do God. It's in practically every single line. There are predefined ends and goals. He's all in favor of creativity and our free creative exploration of these ideas. But I was fascinated to learn from one of the students in the seminar today that one of the only compulsory modules on the Shantiniketan or Vishvabhati syllabus after Tagore died was Tagore studies. In other words, you're free, you're free to be free, but only in a certain kind of way. There is an awful lot of content that's put in. Tagore and Gandhi, as their debate exemplifies, are dealing in theories of human nature, theories of the good life, of virtue, grounded in ultimately transcendental conceptions of truth and the divine. And these tend to be very much off the curriculum. So too, in fact, I should do a more thorough audit, but in the UK context, we rarely even teach the Indian freedom struggle anymore. Certainly not through the lives and thought of the eminent personalities that led the field, even though to me it's one of the most compelling and complex examinations of the quest for human freedom that the world has ever seen. So today we place a huge amount of emphasis on diversifying who is doing the speaking in our syllabus, and for very, very good reason. But in order to learn to disagree well, to diversify the content that we're engaging with, to maybe, in an old-fashioned phrase, broaden our minds to other possibilities and ways of thinking, perhaps we also need to not just diversify the identity of the speaker, but the substance of their speech too. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. The motif of alienation seems really important across your understanding of Tagore. And then we see it again and again, these terms you said he recoiled from: the uniformity, regimentation, homogeny, and Mussolini and Hitler, the kind of Gleichschaltung of those societies, and the mechanization of people through nationalism, the mechanization of people for one nationalist purpose. So one question that comes up, and I think this came up in the seminar too, is if Tagore is this idealist as we talked about in the German sense, with these affinities as we talked about to Hegel, he has a sense, and as you said, the goal of human history. I'm curious to hear more about, but I know it's difficult to sort of try to pin down what those are because he is a complicated, nuanced thinker. But certain things come to mind, particularly a kind of unalienated human and creative state, but also informed by a kind of by Indian wisdom. Since, as you talked about earlier this week, as he's kind of recentering modernity in a kind of Indian modernity, and sees Western modernity as just one of many potentially. And I think also you said earlier today, I think it's very helpful, is he's positing a counter modernity. So that's one thing, and that's really my main question. But I had two other small observations. It occurs to me that Gandhi's fast unto death to prevent a separate electorate. For me, I can't help but see Ambedkar in the background of this, and remember that Tagore uses this expression, a moral tyranny or a moral tyrant. And is it also, it's interesting that he doesn't see this kind of forcing of the issue as also a kind of, potentially a kind of moral tyranny, especially given how Ambedkar sees this same moment. And then the last thing, and I don't know if you want to take a stab at this, but I think, how do you understand the different cultural politics between Tagore and Gandhi? For example, I love this what you said right in the beginning, that there's this sense, if you don't know Bangla, then how can you really engage with Tagore seriously? But no one makes the same remark about Gandhi if you don't know Gujarati, for example. And when that made me think of several sort of world thinkers that also operate in English, but operate in another language too, and it's not. But with Tagore, there's this special problem that if you don't know Bangla, then somehow you're missing an essential part of Tagore. So that's, yeah.
Thank you so much, Rahul. Yeah, okay. So on this issue of telos, did you call it? What's the sort of...
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting question. It takes us into, again, the difficulties with Tagore. So I'll frame this in the context of democracy and, this appropriation of Tagore as this education for democracy, a liberal thinker and so on. When you pick up the big tomes on Tagore, philosophy of Rabindranath Tagore, huge fat books, look through the index, look through the contents, read the pages, get the digital version, do a Control F on the word democracy, you don't find it. Tagore was very muted about democracy. So when it comes to this idea of, is he modern or counter-modern or alternative modernities, it seems to me that the end he was desiring was actually a romanticized vision of a kind of pre-colonial India in which people would return particularly to more natural environments. But within those village environments, Rabindranath was relatively at ease with social hierarchy. That's clear. I mean, he is an aristocrat. There are different ways of framing it, and I think it's really important that Tagore kind of lives and thrives through critical engagement in the present, that we don't just sort of hero worship and say, oh gosh, this guru has all the answers. And so there's a way of framing him actually as a radical conservative. He has quite conservative views in some ways, but very radical, in other ways. So he does talk a lot about about village life, the recovery of rural harmony, and the whole Sriniketan project around rural reconstruction is about giving dignity and proper work to the peasantry. But within that structure, he gets his students to go out and give talks, and music and art are, of course, part of everybody's daily life. But actually, he prizes the creative aesthetic over, for example, the textual and the written. So it's more important for people to sing and play than it is for them to study, basic literacy or mathematics or so on. Those things are important too, but there's a hierarchy. We talked a little bit about his educational philosophy, and he has this powerful letter that he writes in the 30s where he talks about that children's earth is taken away from them and replaced with geography, that our language is taken away and replaced by grammar. He's talking about the formalism of education versus the natural, emotional connections that he says humans have with each other and the natural world. And that joyful, creative impulse, which he says, again, is inherent in our condition if it can be revealed. And the interesting thing, again, about, was Tagore influenced by Britain, by the West, and so on? In his writings about education, he is very clearly negative about colonial education in India. I mean, profoundly so. In his critique of the city, as we talked about, he has some quite disturbing things to say about Calcutta as a city. Doesn't actually like it, according to many of his writings. All of these things are alien impositions that have come through colonial modernity. So where he's explicit about the place he wants to move to in rural reconstruction, in education, we see more of a recovery of traditions rather than the creation of something which is new. So he sort of argues that the resources are there, and he would probably also say that he didn't need to read Hegel to grasp idealism either. that was also there in the Indian tradition, which, as we established, is vast and chronologically very long and incredibly rich. So you can often find what you're looking for if you look hard enough. Ambedkar, or rather the moment of the Gandhi fast. This to me is very interesting because I think at a personal level, he was sort of somewhat skeptical about Gandhi at the outset. He wrote letters to Andrews saying, I'm willing to sit at Gandhi's feet, and pay homage to him if he advances the right ideals, and big if. But that interaction in 32, I mean, when Gandhi is literally minutes from death, Tagore travels all the way from Shantiniketan and cradles this fragile body and sings Gitanjali in Bengali. There's a really deep affective economy that's at work here. And I think over that period of time, Tagore has grown to believe that Gandhi actually incarnates some of the ideals of love that he thinks are inherent in the history of India. So I think he has, it's almost, that's why the parallel with Christ is quite sort of revealing. And I think Tagore was quite sort of open to that, but didn't need it as such. We have this man here. But within 2 years, they're having an almighty ding-dong over the Bihar earthquake, where Gandhi says the Bihar earthquake is a punishment for caste, and Tagore is pulling his hair out and saying, this is ridiculous. These are scientific, natural phenomena. These are not messages from God. So there isn't a permanent reconciliation, but that particular moment, I think that fast at that moment, I think Tagore really sees something very profound, which is why he doesn't interpret it as moral tyranny, but rather an act of supreme love, to use that kind of language. And then your last point about the politics of Bengal, there's a funny paradox, really, which is, Tagore's critique of nationalism is, I think, very well developed, very clear, although often somewhat ignored. He defines it narrowly as a political ideology. It's a political ideology, and it's not really anything else. It's not love of your country. It's not patriotism even. It's a political ideology which wishes to make the nation synonymous with the state. So it's a nation state. That's what he has fixed in his lens. That's what he thinks is so damaging to Indian society. But the paradox is, did anyone in human history ever single-handedly produce so much material which fed cultural nationalism? I mean, I'm not quite sure. I'm not qualified to answer the question, but I wonder. Look at the cultural output that Tagore produced. And I think that's why his standing in Bengal, but remember, that's Bengali nationalism, if that, well, it was a thing, very much a thing. But that's part of the politics of India in the 20th century, right? Is Bengali nationalism and other forms of nationalism being subsumed into a wider kind of framework. But I just think his creative output is so rich and so immense that and resonates so deeply in the psyche of Bengalis that he's almost unique in that cultural politics of whether we're qualified to talk about him or not. I admit fully and humbly that there is that huge hinterland of cultural material that is not easily accessed, and the translations I often think are problematic. But we know that with many languages, right? Poetry doesn't translate very well. It's very difficult to do because it's so embedded in the structure of feeling. But all I'm saying is there's a whole other Tagore which is very accessible and I think very meaningful and powerful. And so we shouldn't sort of just close that off because of the literary dimension.
I just want to say thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate your talk. I have to say, there were so many interesting layers to the talk, and I really kind of enjoyed your nuanced look at the debates between Gandhi and Tagore and their profound sympathy. And I think that's the word you used, or those sets of words: profound sympathy, vulnerability, ability to be wrong. That the moment of learning is in quote unquote virtuous behavior and disagreeing well. I think we can do with a lot more of that in the world.